The alley was silent the next morning, save for the faint hum of the city waking up beyond its confines. Marcus sat slumped against the wall, his back stiff and sore from the hard concrete. The night had been brutal, bitterly cold and restless, the kind of night where survival itself felt like a victory. His stomach growled fiercely, a cruel reminder of the bread he'd given to the stray cat the night before. He glanced around, hoping to see the scrappy grey feline again, but the alley was empty. The cat had probably moved on, Marcus thought. Maybe it had found someone else to help it survive. He couldn't blame it. As he rubbed his hands together, trying to coax some warmth into his fingers, his mind wandered back to better days. A time when he had a warm bed to sleep in and food in the fridge. That life felt like a distant memory, almost like it belonged to someone else. Marcus hadn't always lived like this. Just a year ago, he'd had a steady job at a manufacturing plant. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept him afloat. He'd even managed to squirrel away a little money each month, dreaming of saving up enough to rent a better apartment or buy a car. But then the layoffs started. The company had struggled for years, but no one thought it would shut down entirely. Yet one day, the announcement came. They were closing the plant. Over 200 workers were left without jobs, and Marcus was one of them. At first, he was optimistic. He had skills, a good work ethic, and a strong resume. Surely he'd find something else quickly. But weeks turned into months, and the rejection letters piled up. He applied everywhere: warehouses, retail stores, even fast food joints, but no one was hiring. Or if they were, they wanted younger workers who could be paid less. His savings dwindled faster than he thought possible. Rent was due, bills piled up, and eventually his landlord gave him an ultimatum.
"If you can't pay by the end of the month, you'll have to leave,"
she'd said, her voice cold and detached. He tried to bargain for more time, but it was no use. By the time the eviction notice was taped to his door, Marcus had already packed what little he could carry. He spent the first few weeks couch surfing with friends, but the offers quickly dried up. No one wanted a perpetually unemployed man sleeping on their couch indefinitely. Now here he was, living in the shadows of the city, surviving on scraps and handouts. Every day was a battle against hunger, against the cold, and against the hopelessness that threatened to consume him. He'd learned to navigate the unwritten rules of life on the streets, which alleys were safe, which shelters had open beds, and which diners had dumpsters worth scavenging. But even with those strategies, survival wasn't guaranteed. As he sat in the alley that morning, Marcus's thoughts turned to the cat again. He couldn't shake the image of its piercing green eyes, the way it had looked at him as if it understood his pain. He felt a pang of guilt for resenting the cat last night. It wasn't the cat's fault he was in this position. If anything, the cat was just another victim of a world that didn't care about the weak. He pulled his coat tighter around him, though it did little to keep out the chill. The hunger was worse than usual today, a deep, clawing ache that made it hard to focus on anything else. He needed to find food, but the thought of getting up and searching the city for something edible felt like an impossible task. By midday, Marcus finally forced himself to move. He shuffled out of the alley, his body stiff and protesting with every step. The streets were busy, filled with people rushing to work or shopping for the holidays. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. Most people didn't even notice him, and the few who did quickly looked away, as if acknowledging his existence would taint their own lives. He made his way to the diner where he'd found the sandwich yesterday. The dumpster out back was a goldmine compared to most, often filled with discarded meals that were still edible if you didn't mind the smell. But when he arrived, the dumpster was locked. Marcus swore under his breath. The owner must have decided to crack down on scavengers. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it still stung. He leaned against the wall, trying to think of his next move. The shelters wouldn't serve lunch for another few hours, and he didn't have the energy to beg on the street corner. As he stood there, the door to the diner opened and a waitress stepped out. She was carrying a trash bag, which she tossed into a smaller bin by the back door. Her eyes flicked to Marcus for a moment before she quickly looked away and went back inside. Marcus sighed. He knew what she'd seen, a gaunt, disheveled man who looked more like a ghost than a person. He hated how people saw him now, as if he were invisible until he became a nuisance. With no food to be found, Marcus wandered the streets aimlessly. He passed by shops filled with warm lights and holiday decorations, their windows displaying lavish feasts and happy families. It was a cruel contrast to his own reality. He stopped outside a grocery store and lingered near the entrance, watching as shoppers came and went. His stomach growled loudly, and he felt a pang of shame. He hated the idea of begging, but desperation was beginning to override his pride. Just as he was about to approach someone, a security guard stepped outside and gave him a hard look. Marcus didn't wait to be told to leave. He turned and walked away, his head down, his shoulders slumped. By the time evening came, Marcus found himself back in the same alley where he'd started. The day had been fruitless, and the ache in his stomach had turned into a dull, relentless throb. He sank to the ground, leaning against the wall as exhaustion overtook him. As he closed his eyes, he heard a familiar sound, a soft meow. His eyes snapped open, and there it was, the scrappy grey cat. It sat a few feet away, staring at him with those same piercing green eyes.
"You again?"
Marcus murmured, his voice hoarse. The cat meowed again, stepping closer. It didn't seem afraid of him, which was unusual for a stray. Marcus reached out a hand, and the cat sniffed it cautiously before rubbing its head against his fingers. For a moment, Marcus forgot about his hunger and his pain. He scratched behind the cat's ears, feeling a faint warmth in his chest.
"I don't have anything for you,"
he said softly. The cat didn't seem to mind. It curled up beside him, purring softly as if to say, "I'm here anyway." Marcus leaned his head back against the wall, letting the sound of the cat's purring lull him into a fragile sense of peace. For the first time in days, he didn't feel completely alone.